Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the former chair of Tony Abbott's Indigenous Advisory Council, Warren Mundine, Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister, James McGrath, who ran the LNP's successful Queensland election campaign in 2012, journalist Fran, who delivers news with a comedy twist for The Feed, the editor of Guardian Australia, Lenore, and Queensland Labor MP Murray Watt. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time. And you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Well, the first question tonight comes from Jonathan at Woodward.
Australian banks received a $120 billion bailout back in 2008 when the Rudd government guaranteed their loans. This insurance policy, courtesy of taxpayers, is worth about $5 billion a year. And what do we get in return? Flagrant disregard for the law, fee gouging and recklessness, such as having the highest exposure to residential mortgages in the world. In light of some Queensland nationals calling for an inquiry into the banks, why shouldn't the banks be held accountable with the Royal Commission? And has the millions they donate to political parties each year influenced the government's decision not to hold a full inquiry? Let's
start with Lenore Taylor. Bring us up to date.
Well, I think it's looking like the banking inquiry will happen.
Or not a Royal Commission.
Not a Royal Commission, but an inquiry set up by the Parliament. And in a way, you know, I don't think that's a bad thing. I tend to agree with you. The banks are subsidised by virtue of the banking guarantee. There's been this whole string of scandals. They're still working so hard for this inquiry not to happen. They're lobbying, they've got television ads. One wonders, even though the government has put in a whole lot more regulation and accountability requirements on the banks, they're still really trying to avoid this inquiry. You know, I think we deserve to know what went on and why it went on.
Are we going to get it courtesy of the Nationals? I mean, in The Guardian today, Barnaby Joyce has broken his silence from the hustings.
So Barnaby Joyce is saying that once the New England by-election is out of the way, the Nationals will consider whether they all fall in line behind a banking inquiry rather than just the few renegades who've been pushing it. And I think momentum is certainly going in that direction.
Another one broke ranks late this afternoon, Lou O'Brien.
So a lower house member. So it's looking like they'll have the numbers in the lower house to get it through.
OK, James McGrath, looks like they'll have the numbers.
Barnaby comes back. The government is opposed to a Royal Commission. We believe that we've improved the regulations that are involved with the banking and the finance sector, but if
they want it, they should have it. Is that the new government position?
Well, I think that they've indicated to Australia in terms of what they're going to do in terms of a commission of inquiry through Parliament, and if they do that next week, well, yeah, good on them.
James, you think it's a good thing, do you?
No, I'd say good on them for exercising their decision-making in that regards. One of the things that we face in Australia at the moment is we've become too almost corporatist in a way, that if anyone breaks away and has a different opinion or disagrees with where collective thought is going or their own party, then it's a massive scandal, it's a problem. There has been a history in the coalition, the Liberal Party and the National Party, of having strong people having strong views in relation to a variety of issues. And I sit here as a Liberal National Party senator from Queensland, if some of my National Party colleagues wish to support or set up a commission of inquiry into the banking and finance sector, well, they're exercising their decision making. You know, good on them. That's what you have a parliament for.
Yep. Ultimately, do you think it'll be a good thing?
I think that we know there are issues with the banking sector. We've seen recently in terms of what's happened with CommBank, and we believe that we're improving or are improving the regulation to do with the banking and financial sector. Our view is that a Royal Commission, for example, will just see a lot of lawyers make a lot of money. And look, if you're a union steward for the lawyers, well, you'll probably be very happy about that.
But a wide-ranging parliamentary inquiry, which is what they're talking about, there's going to be a vote. And, of course, they're talking about crossing the floor. I mean, are you going to cross the floor with them? Or will both sides of the LNP, as it were, the Liberals and the Nationals, decide, actually, it's a good idea? We shouldn't be seen to be split in the federal parliament. We should all vote on this together.
Well, let's see what happens next week.
Right. You're absolutely not.
That was me not answering the question.
But you're not ruling out voting for yourself.
Well, let's see what happens next week in terms of where it ends up with my National Party colleagues.
Okay,
the government's position is to oppose a Royal Commission and also to oppose a commission of inquiry into the banks. But if there are the numbers in the Parliament, well, my view is, well, that's what Parliament's there for.
Yeah, OK, we'll go to Murray.
Tony, I think it's really interesting that we've got a minister of the government who is clearly opening the door to a banking royal commission. So good work, James.
I don't think I'm opening the door to a banking royal commission. I think it's pretty strong about us saying that's not going to happen.
Obviously, I, as a Labor senator, and all of the Labor Party very much agrees with Jonathan's point that the cultural problems in Australian banks just seem to be so deep that the only way we can actually get this fixed is by a full and real royal commission. You're right. There are a number of National Party MPs and senators from Queensland over the last couple of days who've all of a sudden found their courage and found their voice and now want to move motions in the Senate. I think it's just really disappointing that it took a pretty bad result for the LNP in Queensland before they actually found their courage. If they were actually genuine about this and really did want to fix up the banking system, they would have joined with Labor well over 12 months ago in supporting a Royal Commission rather than having to take a hiding in Queensland and all of a sudden think it's a good idea.
Why didn't Bill Shorten do it when he was Financial Services Minister for 3 years? Why didn't Labor do it when you were in power for 6 years? What we're finding constantly with Labor at the moment is you get into opposition, you go, oh, we should have done that when we were in power. You saw it with with gay marriage and you've seen it now with this Royal Commission into banking. You did nothing when you were in power, you lose and you go, well, how can we play politics here? When you're in power, you did not do anything to improve the financial sustainability of the banking sector in terms of the regulation. So, please.
You're actually the ones in government at the moment. So,
but they're the ones being hypocrites.
Not for long.
Let's hear from Warren Mundine.
Look, I don't entirely agree with the Royal Commission because I agree in regard to Royal Commissions that the only people at the end of the day make a lot of money. You spend, we just had a Royal Commission in Dondale in the Northern Territory. That's $50 million. They get a lot of answers we would have got anyway. So I think, I don't think the government's going to be able to avoid actually doing a commission of inquiry. And quite frankly, I think that may be a good idea in regard to every so often we should have these inquiries anyway, just to see how the whole system is working and making sure that things are on track.
Jan, what do you think?
Ooh, yeah. That's a bit of a, that's a big question. I must say I'm a tiny bit nervous, and I got this piece of advice from a friend of mine who was like, just imagine everybody in the room in their underpants. And I've got to say that's freaking me out even more. Especially because I can't make eye contact with you anymore now, Tony. But
yes, very good.
I've got a tiny note here that just says, generally think financial institutions should be kept an eye on. So that's kind of where I'm at. The banking regulations / Royal Commission into banking, probably not my forte.
Let's go back to our questioner, Jonathan. What do you think? I mean, you're hearing there's going to be a wide-ranging inquiry, very likely.
Well, I'll just say that, Labor's saying that, they're all for it, but the second part of that question went to the influence of money in Australian politics, and I think $2.7 million is the amount that they gave political parties last year. You took a fair share of that as well, Labor. It's taken you a while to come to this decision. So I'll just say that, you're not exactly clean of your hands there.
Sure, but I think, and look, you're right, business makes donations to each side of politics, the Greens as well. I reckon I'd take a punt that banks have probably given more to the Conservative side of politics than Labor, but all sides do it.
I'm unsure about that. I think they're pretty even with their donations.
I'm not, well, whatever it is, but I think if it was the case that banks were influencing our view on this, then we wouldn't be supporting a Royal Commission. And we have taken the position that we support the interests of the Australian public over any bank who may or may not be making donations.
Let's be clear, we're not talking here about a Royal Commission, we're talking about a wide-ranging parliamentary inquiry, a commission of inquiry in the Parliament. Lenore, there's obviously a major difference, but there's no chance of a Royal Commission, is there? And there's just not the votes for it. Or am I wrong about that?
Parliament can't set up a Royal Commission.
Pardon?
Parliament can't set up a Royal Commission.
The only way that could happen is if the momentum in the Parliament was such that the government took that decision, and I can't.
Well, we were hearing about talks in Cabinet, which were leaked only last week, spectacularly, as you say. Do you suppose they were thinking about a Royal Commission?
Well, I think they were worried about the appearance and the actuality of division in the coalition about this. They were worried about losing a vote on the floor of the House. They're obviously we're hearing from the Assistant Minister now that that's not such a worry, but I think it was exercising
big enough
the
of a
minds
worry that we're not actually seeing sittings of the House of Representatives this week.
It was concerning them enough that they decided to have only 4 days of House of Reps rather than 8 days in order to avoid, to minimise the time when it could happen. So it was on the table, but I think a commission of inquiry is much more likely. It would only be the government decision that could bring in a royal commission.
OK, let's move on. We're going to talk about the Queensland election. We've got a question from Casey Silman.
What do you think the coalition needs to do to turn around the results in Queensland? Do you think a change of leader would be enough to retain power federally?
Lenore, we'll start with you again on that.
So I think the problems are much bigger and much more systemic than that, and they're reaching for the change of leader button every time things get dicey. Hasn't worked in the past, and I don't think it would work in the future. I think the big parties are making the mistake of always viewing what happens in elections like the Queensland election from the point of view of them being an unchangeable institution that everything else rotates around. So I'm not suggesting that they should run after the policies of the parties that are nipping away at them from the sides, the Greens or One Nation and the Katters, but rather they should think about why 30% of the electorate isn't voting for the major parties, and they should think about whether they can, both in policy terms and in process terms, straddle or mediate all of the views that are still within their big party umbrella, if you like. People now are used to having, in the digital age, people are used to having agency, having power over what they buy or what they crowdfund or whatever, but parties are still quite closed. People are changing how they view politics in large sense. There's a sort of trend to question the whole sort of neoliberal consensus that existed for many years. And I just feel like the major parties aren't catching up with those changes, aren't thinking through those changes enough, and it's that structural work that they need to do rather than just reaching for a leadership change again.
Jan, what do you think? I mean, every time there's a bit of a setback, and there was in Queensland for the LNP, people start talking about Malcolm Turnbull's leadership.
Please, can we just not have another Prime Minister just yet? I sometimes think that, if you're somebody who is, say, 25 years old in this country, from the year that you were allowed to vote, you will have seen 5 different Prime Ministers, right? So there's already this kind of upheaval in Canberra, or this seeming upheaval where every time something doesn't quite work out, a leader is knifed in the back and another leader replaces them. And this is something that happens, obviously, on both sides of politics. So I would probably have to agree with Lenore and say that a leader is really not the answer. I think that the major parties, again, they really have to look at why they are ceding votes. Labor, why they're ceding votes to the Greens, and the Coalition, why they're ceding votes to One Nation. And I would argue very much that it's a much bigger problem. It's a sort of, this is going to be a terrible analogy and I apologise in advance, but it's almost like a tree, like if you chop off the branches of the tree, the problems are still going to be there, the branches are still going to grow. I think you need to kind of get to the root of the problem, which is not the leadership. James,
what do you think about, perhaps you're reassured by the notion that people don't want to see, or some people anyway, don't want to see a change of leadership at the moment?
I think the challenge for us politicians is when we speak, we don't speak English. We speak a dialect of English, and we use words that no one understands. We're sort of like the love child of like a Dalek and an accountant in terms of the language we use.
Speak for yourself.
And I know sometimes when I don't speak, I don't listen to myself. I go, what did I just say then? It's just, and we've got to. That's part of the problem with I think modern politics is for us as politicians to break through, to try and explain sometimes quite complex economic matters, quite complex social matters, not dumb it down, because I think that's patronising, but communicate better to our people in terms of why there is a problem in Australia, and if we think there is a problem in terms of, say, the tax system, and what we need to do to reform and make it better. And I think that's a challenge for politicians. In terms of my own party in Queensland, the Liberal National Party, go to lnp.org.au and join up. We're a very open party. Join up. You're a member for 12 months. You can pre-select a person to run for Parliament. We've got a federal election in 18 months' time. You might want to run yourself. So, join. We're that type of really open party. But I actually think... What about policy? I think communications... But policy's part of it, and trying to communicate the policies that we take to the election. So I think the LNP in Queensland just recently had some brilliant policies
They just weren't what people wanted.
Well, they do want dams in North Queensland. They do want to make sure that there is a curfew in
North
we do make sure there's a curfew in Townsville to get kids off the streets.
James, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to interrupt the party political broadcast just for a moment. See if you might answer.
I'm shameless.
Just see if you might answer the question, because the question was after
I've forgotten
the result. I'll repeat it for you. After the result in Queensland. Do you think it might be possible that people will be looking around for an alternative federal leader?
No, because I think what the appetite is not for change. It's appetite for us to explain what we're doing, explaining it better. And what I think is, from my side of politics, we're going to focus on meat and potatoes. And the meat is anything to do with the economy. Because the people out there, people in this audience, you mightn't particularly like me, I don't particularly care, but you know that my side of politics, we're good at running the economy. We're good at making sure we can build things value for money, that will lower the taxes. We've got to focus on the meat side of it, and we've also got to focus on what I call the potatoes.
What about the leadership side of it? That's what the question is about.
I think I've answered that. There's no appetite for that. There's appetite for meat and potatoes.
I think I can understand why. I think I can understand why James doesn't want to talk about the leadership, and that's because he was one of the numbers men who got the numbers for Malcolm Turnbull. I'm just wondering if James wants a refund after all this time that Malcolm just hasn't really delivered. Well, there's no doubt that for all that James, and he's doing the right thing, standing by his leader, there is no doubt that Malcolm Turnbull's leadership is dead. And I hear what Jan says. I know that people are really frustrated about the change in leadership, but you've only got to look at the rumblings within the National Party that are growing each and every day. Erica Betts, all the other Conservative forces are out to get Malcolm. They are not going to stop.
The National Party do not get a vote for the Prime Minister. So
very good point.
There's no numbers there.
They're doing a very good job of bringing. They're doing a very good job of bringing one down. Right. I think the other thing in terms of what James has said is that, you know, I've been around politics a long time. I've seen people on Labor and the Conservative side, when they get into trouble, they say, "Oh, you know what? We've just got to communicate better." It's not about that. That is, without doubt, communication is something that all politicians can do better. The fundamental problem the Conservative parties have in this country is that what they are offering people is not what people want. In regional Queensland, an area I spend a lot of time in, the economy is in difficulty. People are losing their jobs. The government has no solutions for what those jobs are going to be. The government is taking the side of big mining companies who are sacking...
They provide jobs.
Who are sacking their...
They provide jobs.
Your government...
provide jobs in regional Australia.
The jobs...
We're going to come to the mining question in a moment, so I'd just like to hear from Warren Mundine on the question that was actually asked.
Well, Lenore sort of hit the nail on the head when she said, you look at the results in Queensland, both parties are in the 30s. You look at the results, the polling at the moment, both major parties are in the 30s. And in fact, when you look at the polling over a long period of time, most people, and a lot of people are abandoning the major parties. And there's a third wave in there, and One Nation is not the party for that. We saw that in the Queensland's election. The problem we're having at the moment is, quite frankly, Malcolm Turnbull has failed, and has failed miserably in this area. I'm being quite honest about that. And also, you look at the Labor side of politics too. They're not much better because they're polling just ahead of the coalition.
Warren, I'm just going to interrupt you there because we've got a gentleman with his hand up down the front there, and hopefully you've got a comment for us. We'll just get a microphone to you, and it's there now.
Yeah, I'm just interested in whether or not you think you're talking about a third wave of politics. One Nation seems to be fairly unstable. Are there other right-wing parties like the Australian Conservatives and others that you think might come through in upcoming elections?
It's interesting in regard to the Australian Conservatives because it's not Cory Bernardi's Australian Conservatives. He's looking at a longer game in regard to the politics of the whole thing. Now, whether he's successful or not, that we'll see that in the long term. The Liberals, the coalition does have a problem in regard to its split between its more small L Liberal and its Conservative wing, and it is an ideological problem. It's not going to be easy to overcome. It's going to be a huge problem from over the years. And so, look, and politics globally are in this position. You look at the United States, where you had Trump win. He's not really a Republican. He's Trump. He was a wild card in this play. You look at Macron in France. For the first time since the Third Republic, you had a two non-people running for the presidency of France. And so it's coming from the left and it's coming from the right. People are not happy with the status quo. And again, Lenore, I'll give it to you again, that the neoliberalism, where everyone's trying to fight for the middle game, is not working anymore because it's just Tweedledee and Tweedledum. people are looking for a difference. They're looking for more fair dinkumus out of their politicians.
OK, Warren, I'm just going to interrupt you there to go to a question about One Nation. State election not that long ago in the 1990s, Pauline Hanson won 11 seats in the Queensland State Parliament. Not so this time. Question from Jim Ellis.
Yes, just like the Black Knight, Pauline Hanson believes that her performance in her own state election was just a flesh wound. But will there be any far-reaching consequences to the One Nation party at the next federal election?
Lenore, I'll start with you. I mean, they polled very high, but that didn't translate into seats.
Yeah, so they polled high, but they didn't campaign smart. I don't think they necessarily campaigned in the right seats. They didn't concentrate their efforts in the seats that they thought they could win. They may get one seat. I think Anthony Green called one seat for them today. Whether or not One Nation is the place where that disaffected vote ends up, I don't know. And they do have this sort of tendency to have structural problems and sort of maverick candidates, and when they do actually get some power, it all falls apart. And as I said, I didn't think they campaigned that smart in this campaign.
But could this translate in a federal election, however? This extent of this into Senate votes? Could
translate into Senate votes. And in any event, there is that 14% or whatever of the Queensland electorate that wanted someone else, and that was disaffected enough with the major parties. So I actually agree that the Australian Conservatives might do okay, because they're probably going to be sort of better organised and better at campaigning. But it's indicative of this disaffection with the major parties.
Jane Fran.
I really don't see this as the end of One Nation. Like a flesh wound, if it is a flesh wound, it's bleeding profusely right now. But I think that bleeding can be stemmed. Yes, they didn't get any seats, or maybe they've just gotten one. I'm not sure. Either way, they didn't get as many seats as what they thought they would. But I was in the US, this was last year, just in the lead up to the US presidential election. And I'm looking at Donald Trump and Pauline Hanson, and these are these two people that you think would have nothing in common, right? Like Donald Trump is...
Apart from red hair.
Apart from flaming beautiful red hair, that's right. But Donald Trump is this like multi-millionaire real estate developer from New York. Pauline Hanson is a former fish and chip shop owner from Ipswich, Queensland, right? You'd think they have nothing in common, but they do, in that they speak to the same people. So they speak to people who essentially feel themselves to be losers of globalisation. They speak to people who feel very disenfranchised from the major parties. They speak to people who are rallying against, I guess, the rise of cosmopolitanism. So the rise of these inner city groups, or the cities that they feel might be controlling the agenda, are controlling policy, are controlling media, and to some extent they feel really left out of that. Now, those issues are not going to go away. So if Pauline Hanson hasn't won any seats in this election, that doesn't mean that the issues that people are flocking to her for are suddenly done. And that's what I would caution.
Let's hear from James, because most of the votes that bled to One Nation came from the LNP.
In some areas, yes, but what the Queensland election showed was that every time that One Nation gets a high vote, you get a Labor government. It happened in 1998, it happened in 2001, and it's probably going to happen in Queensland in 2017. So a lot of what the voters that you're talking about railing against a Labor Party in Queensland who have very much a pro-green, a left-wing green agenda, who are against the dams, against regional Queensland, by voting for One Nation, ironically, you're going to end up with a Labor government, and that's going to hurt Queensland. So it's the job of my party to reach out to those people who have voted for One Nation and bring them back into the fold by focusing on the issues.
Can you do that? Would you have to move further to the right? Because a lot of One Nation voters see the federal government as kind of middle ground, wishy-washy, not conservative.
Well, the thing about the Liberal Party is we've always been a broad church. Sometimes we're a little parish church, and sometimes one of those grand medieval cathedrals in terms of the policy spectrum within the movement. It was set up deliberately to have the small L Liberals and the Conservatives in it. I think we've got to pick up on those issues. But in terms of what the federal government's been doing, I don't want to read out the talking points because it'll bore everybody here. But what have we done? We've cut the taxes. We've cut small business taxes. We've cut income taxes. We've had industrial relations reform.
Sounds like talking
talking points.
James, it's okay. We have heard those ones before.
Tony, I can give your viewers one opinion about why One Nation didn't do as well in Queensland this time as it did back in 1998. And I think that a large part of that was because Labor took a decision very early on that we were going to take Pauline Hanson on. I and a number of other Labor politicians have spent the best part of 12 months out there taking her on and exposing what she does here in Canberra when she actually sells out the very battlers that she says she's there to support. The problem, and as a result of that, Labor's vote in Queensland fell a little bit and we've still got some more work to do, but the LNP's vote collapsed and transferred across to One Nation. The difference is that Labor has taken Pauline Hanson on, exposed her as being a fraud. Even tonight, the LNP doesn't know what they want to do about One Nation. Today, you had Tim Wilson, George Brandis out there saying she's poison, we've got to stay away from her. You've got George Christensen and other people saying we've got to cuddle up to her. You know, James and others, I'm afraid, have had 20 years to work out the answer to one question. Are you going to preference One Nation? And they still don't know what the answer is.
On Saturday, I was at polling booths. I started off in Warwick and ended up in Brisbane, and we had Labor people and union people saying, put the LNP last. So I'm not going to be lectured by the Labor Party here in terms of what they're talking about in terms of how to deal with One Nation.
Okay, James, we've got a question. James, we've got a question about the nature.
Sorry.
A question about the nature of the LNP. It comes from Michael Toms.
With the failure of the LNP experiment in Queensland evident from last weekend's election, isn't it about time that the Liberals and Nationals concede that they can most effectively work as two separate parties in coalition rather than pretending that they can represent every aspect of society as one party?
James.
So what you're saying is that the LNP in Queensland should split and go back to the Liberal Party and the National Party. Well, in terms of looking at the history in relation to that concept, back in 2001, when we faced a similar issue with One Nation, the Liberals ended up with 3 seats. I think that the Nationals ended up with a cricket team. I'm a strong supporter of the Liberal National Party staying a merged party. I think the Liberal National Party has been a successful entity in Queensland in terms of bringing the Conservative vote together. One of the challenges we face on the right of politics in Australia, and I sit here as a proud Tory, is that the fight is no longer just between us and Labor. The fight is become essentially you're up against this axis of leftists on polling day and through the elections, and you've got the good people in the Labor Party and fair play to them, but then you face another political party called the Union Movement. Then you face another political party called Get Up. Then you face another political party called the Greens. And what they do is they have this axis of leftists, and they all want to make sure.
Hashtag
that my party...
axis of leftists.
Axis of leftists.
Do it.
It's trending on Twitter already.
It's trending, baby.
Is that my party, we can win elections against just Labor. But when we're up against essentially 4 other parties who are very well resourced, got more money than my party in Queensland, it makes it very hard to actually win elections. Because I'm always surprised as a Conservative in Queensland, not that we lose elections, I'm actually surprised that occasionally we win an election, considering this Armageddon of leftists that come towards us.
Again, James, I presume that's one of those moments where you actually recall what you just said.
Sometimes.
I'll leave it for 1 minute.
Sometimes I go to screensaver mode too.
Tony, I think this is the problem, is that James comes along here, they've had a bad defeat, and rather than actually having a good hard look at themselves about what they stand for and whether that's what actually people want, it's always someone else's fault. Rather than actually going back to look at what they're offering people, whether it's consistent with what people in the world want, don't just look in Queensland or Australia. All around the world, people are actually looking for governments to be on their side. But instead, down here in Canberra, we've got a government that is giving tax cuts to millionaires, siding with the banks. It is not what people want.
All right, so I'm going to interrupt both of you because we've got a question about one of the potential consequences of this election, and it's quite a big one. It's from Imogen Zethoven.
Yes. In light of the Queensland election result, where Queenslanders voted overwhelmingly against the $1 billion loan to Adani, and in light of the unprecedented severe coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef, which killed about 49% of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef, is the federal government going to listen to the vast majority of the wishes of the Australian people and revoke the approval to the Carmichael coal mine.
Right, before I come to the politicians, I'll go to Warren Mundine. Warren, you've been quite scathing of what you call white activists who oppose this mine.
Well, it's not the mine entirely. It's across Australia. You saw at James Price Point, and we saw, where white activists have gone into Aboriginal communities and cause nothing but problems. They usually find one person and they use that person. They sit him up or sit her up as the leader of the Aboriginal groups. And just this week, in regard to James Price Point, the people that the Greens and these green activists have got up, it turned out to be not the traditional owners of that land. So it was a whole false campaign. What really gets up my nerve is that Aboriginal people get their land back through native title, and they're living at the bottom end of poverty, and then these green activists from the cities come out there and say, no, you can't have economic development, you can't do things on your land, you just stay in poverty forever, and that's the way it is. And that really gets up my goat. Now, whether people agree with mining or they agree with agriculture, they agree with everything else, if you're going to take that all away, because my challenge to the green activists and to the Green Party is, what are you going to work with Aboriginal people to get economic development, to lift themselves out of poverty and to get things moving? And it's not only Aboriginal people. You look at rural Queensland, you look at rural Australia as a whole, and I listened to Jason Clare. He gave a talk at the Australian Chamber of Commerce meeting, and he talked about the 80% of the last few jobs created in Australia were within 5 kilometres of the Melbourne CBD and the Sydney CBD. So are we all going to end up living in Sydney CBD or Melbourne CBD? So this is what really gets my goat. All these people love to clap and cheer about this stuff. What are you going to do for economic development for Aboriginal people to get them out of poverty? That's the question I chuck back to you.
All right, we're going to... Lenore, The Guardian's been pretty consistent in its editorial position against the Adani mine. We'll go to the actual political questions been posed here in a moment. But first, what do you say to Warren, who's saying this is a pathway to jobs for Indigenous people?
I'd say I don't think it's true that the W&J people, who are the Indigenous group that are against the Adani, the Carmichael mine, is just one person. I think that's a group of people, and that will play itself out in the courts.
The court system already did. The federal court already, at the last federal court, the voting number was 294 people for, and this is the judge said this. So this is the judge said 294 of the W&J people voted for the mine, and only one person voted against it. And this is so what's going to happen? You can come over here and say these things, but it really gets my goat.
I haven't said anything yet.
So it is supported by out of the 5 groups. We're going to have by the 4.
We have to hear what Lenore has to say here.
Yeah, sure.
That vote is being challenged in the court, and the court will work out whether it was a legitimate vote or not, and the court will determine who the legitimate native title holders are for the Indigenous Land Use Agreement. But in terms of the Adani mine more generally, if you put those issues to one side, I think the people of Queensland have been sold a bit of a pup. I mean, both the major parties were supportive of the mine. The Labor Party in Queensland differentiated itself somewhat belatedly in terms of saying that they would veto the loan, the $1 billion loan to the mine, but both parties were still pro-mine on the basis of jobs. Everything I read suggests that the number of jobs that Adani would create is not that great. It's easily surpassed by renewable jobs that are already happening or are in the pipeline in that same area of Queensland, and they come without all of the negatives, including the greenhouse emissions, the water from the Artesian Basin, the potential damage to the Great Barrier Reef, and come without directly contradicting our national greenhouse gas policy. So I think Queensland's been sold a pup on this.
Let's go to James McGrath. Now, Premier Palaszczuk, and she may or very likely will be Premier again, promised to stop the $1 billion loan, and she has the power to do it. Will that stop the mine?
I don't know. I'm not running the mine. That's up to the shareholders in the mine. There's no loans. I should say something. No loans actually been approved. So we're talking almost hypotheticals here.
It has been proposed by the federal government by one of your own ministers.
The minister who oversees the loans. They're advocating for it.
It's up to the company to put an application into a body called the Northern Australian Infrastructure Facility, which is independent of government, and they'll make the decision. But I want to go to Warren's point. All those people who clapped the lady's question, well, what jobs are you going to give to my people in Queensland who are unemployed at the moment? It's okay for you sitting down here in Sydney. It's okay here with you turn on your air conditioning. It's okay here, you've got your nice jobs. What are you going to do for unemployment in regional Queensland? And whether it's Indigenous or white.
James, or people, James,
unemployment in Queensland
James, before you, James,
30%. James, so shame on you for clapping. James, people want to get jobs. Sorry.
Before you castigate the entire audience, you may have noticed there were people clapping for Warren Mundine as well.
No, I said the first lot of clappers, not the second lot of clappers. The second lot of clappers, I like you.
Okay, all right. You only like happy clappers.
James,
now, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, the Great Barrier Reef is beautiful. It is a national wonder. It is an international wonder. Of course, there would be people who want to protect it. I sympathise to some extent with what you guys are saying. I was in Bowen in 2014, and I was doing a story on, I think it's the Abbott's Point. Abbott Point. That's I should know that. Yes, Abbott Point. And you know, talking to people in Bowen, there was a real concern that the economy was depressed, the town was depressed, small businesses were closing, people were leaving, there was an uncertainty about their future. And I think to some extent that a lot of people who live in Sydney and Melbourne, I think they hear about that, but they don't live that reality. Now, whether the mine is the answer to that, I'm not sure about. And the question is that you raise, Lenore, is there a better way to provide jobs to people in Queensland than the mine? And I would argue, and I would look into sustainability of mines, because
are there and they're starting now. They're being built.
But they're not filling the jobs. I can tell you that now. They're not filling the jobs. I've just finished a 5-week tour of regional and remote Australia, starting in Palm Island, going right across and finishing in Kununurra. In the community, not sitting in Melbourne and Sydney, not writing papers and that, actually sitting on the ground, talking to the people in pubs, talking to people on the ground. And I do this quite regularly. Every few weeks I actually go out into regional and remote Australia and talk to people. Talk to white people, talk to farmers, talk to townspeople, talk to Aboriginal people, talk to all this stuff. And I can tell you the morale and the economic future for those communities are in trouble, and in massive trouble. All the people in Sydney, every time a project comes up, no matter what that project is, they'd say no to it, and they have run massive campaigns, and they're funded by billionaires who go out there to stop people who've got no jobs, who are funding. And look, Lenore, I agreed with you a lot of stuff before, but on this issue, you have no answer in regard to rural and remote Australia and jobs.
There are at least as many renewable energy jobs.
It's not going to happen, I can tell that now.
It is happening. They're being approved and they're being constructed.
Where are the jobs? I just see unemployment when I'm in.
Warren, just hold on, you've made your point, which is to hear Lenore, and I need to hear from Murray.
There are at least as many as are being proposed by Adani. So neither of those industries are going to solve the problem that you're legitimately pointing to, but there are at least as many renewable energy jobs as Adani is promising in the construction phase. And after the construction phase, it doesn't have that many jobs at all.
Murray.
To address Imogen's question directly, federal Labor has always said that we shouldn't be providing a taxpayer-funded loan to an overseas billionaire, and that's obviously the position that the state Labor government got to as well. But the broader point about jobs, I actually don't think it's helpful to be pitting, Sydney and Melbourne people versus regional Queenslanders. I actually like all of them, and if we're Australian politicians, we should actually be looking for ways to bring the community together on these issues. The problem that James's government has got, and he's saying, why don't you who are clapping out there come up with jobs? Mate, that's your job. You're in the government. And I'll give you a couple of ideas. Federal Labor has said we would devote $1 billion of the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, which still hasn't approved a single project in Queensland 2 or 3 years after it was created. $1 billion for tourism, massive industry in Northern Australia. There's opportunities there. Lenore's right. There actually are renewable jobs happening in Queensland as well. Defence manufacturing. The manufacturing industry in regional Queensland, which used to service the mining industry, has been in decline. Let's get some of those billions of dollars of contracts of defence manufacturing, sorry Sydney and Melbourne, up to regional Queensland.
No, you should be saying sorry Christopher Pyne in South Australia.
I'll never apologise.
Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC fact check and the conversation website for the results. Next question comes from Katie Atchison.
After Brexit, an unusually high number of young people were mobilised to take part in this year's British election, with 65,000 young people enrolling to vote to participate in the same-sex marriage survey. It seems like Australian young people are mobilising. What does this mean for the next state and federal elections?
Jan.
Ooh. I think it means that that you're going to have to listen to us a little bit more. What's happening in the States, and I think what's happening here as well, is that for the first time ever, millennials surpassed baby boomers as the biggest voting bloc in the country. And the unfortunate reality with boomers, no offence, is that you're all going to die.
X.
You know what? I think the millennials are going to die as well. This
is an intergenerational war that is going on here right now. And so I think that we're going to start seeing millennials, who probably won't be young people by the time they get into sort of positions of power, I think dictating the agenda a little bit more. The thing that I worry about is that we've got social media now, and we didn't have that 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And what happens on social media is you feel engaged, you feel like you're doing something and you're making a difference and you're joining groups and you're being kind of active, but that doesn't necessarily translate to political participation. And so that's going to be really interesting kind of moving forward to see the dynamic and kind of what actually eventuates from what is seemingly engaged young people.
Now, the question referred to Brexit, and well, actually the election after Brexit, really, when Jeremy Corbyn, let's say old white male socialist, would end up being backed by an awful lot of young millennials. Now, why is that? It's obviously happened in America too with Bernie Sanders. What do they see in these old men?
Well, I think... you know what?
Especially since you obviously think they're going to die very soon.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for pointing that one out. I think millennials are in a position whereby a lot of them, and this is mirrored around the world, they can't afford housing. They are saddled with university debt. They are kind of saddled with debt in general. They are facing the prospect of a very fractured job market, right? You have millennials don't stay in jobs for 25 years like our parents did, for example. So there's an uncertainty in the workplace that is happening now. And I think that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, I think they speak to that. I mean, we saw in Australia a couple of years ago, maybe it was even last year's budget. I'm not fact-check this one, internet. But we've seen in previous budgets, there was no mention of anything for young people, right? And so I'm not surprised that they're looking towards, you know, these old kind of silver foxes, Tony.
Let's go back to our questioner, Katie Atchison. I mean, you obviously asked the question. It sounded like you had thought about it a fair bit. What do you think?
Well, Australian young people are the swing vote in this country for the last, I think it's 4 of the 5 elections. They were the group that really swung the way it's going. But we haven't, Jan's right, we haven't actually seen any of the political parties really trying to court young people and their issues. They're talking about issues about older people and issues about negative gearing, but they won't touch the fact that young people can't afford houses. We have to do something about some really significant issues, and young people have very clear opinions about things, and neither of the major parties are really trying to address that.
Okay, Lenore Taylor.
I think one of the consequences of the marriage equality survey is that big surge in enrolments, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the next federal election. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon.
How do you think it'll play out?
Well, it depends on the policies that the major parties put forward. I mean, if someone has a really good policy about rental affordability, a really good policy about for higher education, you know, their votes up for grabs. I don't think these are rusted-on voters. I think they're voters who make up their mind on the issues. I think they respond to authenticity, to people who talk in words that they make up themselves. So they don't respond to the sort of polished political art the talking points at all. And it will, I think they're votes that are there for the taking.
OK, yeah, Murray, I'll hear from the politicians, but briefly if we can, because a few questions.
I think Jan's right. I think that it is a really exciting opportunity for young people to get more involved in the political process. But I think, frankly, I do think that it is probably going to favour Labor a little bit, having younger voters, more younger voters on the roll, because
the Greens.
And it may well help the Greens as well. It depends what policies are put forward, as you say. But if you're a young person in Australia under this federal government at the moment, it doesn't matter what kind of young person you are losing out. If you're on the dole, they're cutting the dole and making you drug test. If you're in apprenticeships, they're cutting apprenticeships, funding for apprenticeships. If you're in work, they're cutting penalty rates. If you're a uni student, they're cutting uni funding and putting your fees up. Whatever kind of young person out there, this government is coming after you. So I think there's going to be a really clear choice for young people come the next election.
James.
One of the reasons Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn done well, because they spoke a lot of socialist claptrap. And
that'll work with the young people.
And you look at, especially Bernie Sanders with his agenda, it was a far left agenda. You look at Jeremy Corbyn, it was a far left agenda. He wanted to renationalise the railways.
Can you just explain why you think that appealed to young voters?
I think they were sold a pup by him. I think the real challenge for governments is we've got to make sure in terms of young people, don't patronise them by saying, oh, you're a young person, let's speak specifically about young person issues. We've got to focus on what are we doing to create employment. I'm going back to my meat and potatoes. What are we doing for the economy in terms of cutting taxes so they get more money in their back pocket? What are we doing about cutting taxes for businesses so they can employ more people? That's what the government is doing. That's what...
Sorry, hang on, we'll get you a microphone so you can make your comment. Go ahead.
Meat and potatoes will just constipate you. That's the problem, I think, with the current policies we're seeing.
OK, we'll take that as a comment. You might want to respond to it, though, James.
Maybe you need to try green smoothies.
You need a bit of kale.
I like meat and potatoes. There's nothing like a T-bone, some nice chilli roast potatoes. So that, the government's got to focus on the economy. That's the best thing we can do in terms of making sure that there are jobs for people out there and that businesses can grow. Because that's what if we do that, we focus on our meat and potatoes, regardless of your bowel movements over there. We can make sure that in 18 months' time, when people choose between Bill Shorten and his quite left-wing agenda and Malcolm Turnbull and Barnaby Joyce in terms of what we want to do for Australia, that the choice will be pretty clear.
OK, James, got another hand up in the audience. James, just going to interrupt you for a moment. Got another hand up in the audience. Go ahead.
I think we're hearing what is symptomatic across Australia, and that is that condescending tone that somehow people can be just placed into a box of left or right agendas. I mean, really, politics in Australia and around the world is three-dimensional. People can oppose a mine and still care for the environment and care for the economy. They are not mutually exclusive, and the more you keep dividing Australia with those polarising leftist agenda material, the more you are burning your bridges with Australia.
Yeah, well, look...
Okay.
I'll come back to that.
You can come back to it later, but...
I will not apologise for being on the sides of business and jobs, and neither will this government.
OK, James. This is Q&A. As you can hear, it's live, it's interactive. If you have a question but can't get to the studio, you can record a video question or use Skype to ask your question live anywhere in the country, indeed anywhere in the world. Go to our website or contact us by email and Twitter to find out how to do that. Our next question is a video. It's from law lecturer Holly Dole-McAway.
The recommendations from the Northern Territory Royal Commission into Juvenile Justice and Child Protection do not go far enough. Setting the age of criminal responsibility at 12 is inconsistent with the United Nations standard of 14 to 16 years of age and will not prevent our justice system from criminalising very young children, particularly Aboriginal children. The report also fails to emphasise the importance of criminal charges for those responsible at all levels for the torture of child detainees. How will the perpetrators of these crimes against children be made accountable? And how do we prevent the criminalisation of very young children?
Yeah. Sorry, almost cut off the questioner there. Warren Mundine, we'll start with you.
Well, I just finished the inquiry into the South Australian prisons in February this year and into adult prisons. And of course, through that process, we had to also look at juvenile detention centres. I also sat on the Juvenile Crime Prevention Committee for 4 years, investigating and looking at global research in this area. Now, I've always made a statement in the last 15 years after sitting down and looking at the research that locking up kids actually doesn't work. That's what the global statistics tell us, and also Australian jurisdictions tell us. So for us, it's about I also was very critical of the Royal Commission into Dondale. I thought it was a waste of money, and I still stand by that comment. We spent $50 million on that, $50 million, which could have been, that's the budget for the Aboriginal Economic Development Program annually. So we could have spent money. And it come up with recommendations which we knew already, recommendations that I knew back in 2004 and commented on. For us, it's about, in regard to lifting the age from 12 to 14, and that it doesn't really make a difference. The real issues are...
Well, no, the age, I think the question is stating that the age has gone to 12.
12, but even lifting that from 12 to 14 is not going to make the difference. The real difference is what's happening in those communities. And when you go into those statistics and you work out of the sexual abuse, we had 12 suicides in Eastern Kimberleys recently, and each of those kids were sexually abused from 7 years old. I was a classified person on the National Crimes Commission, and we saw report after report of just violence and unemployment. Getting back to that question, we want to talk about Adani, is the massive unemployment and generational breakdown within these communities. I had a report of 2 kids that were picked up in the Birdswood area, one Aboriginal girl and one Aboriginal boy, and they did 5 generations of that family, and each of those families. Every one of that generation was sexually abused as a kid, have mental health issues, had been physically abused, have drug and alcohol problems, and were known to police in the Department of Family and Community Affairs from the age of 5. These are the real issues that we've got to deal with in these communities, and these are the things that we've got to focus on. Education was low. In fact, a lot of it was kids didn't even go to school. You look at the Dondale kids, you see all the same things in that area. I sat in a juvenile detention centre 2 years ago in Alice Springs talking to 32 kids. And I asked the question, I said, are you happy being in the detention centre? And they said yes. And I said, why? They said it was safer in here than being out in their township. Now, I'm not talking about hairy-fairy stuff. I'm talking about actually sitting and talking with these people and listening to their stories and what's going on. And these are the things that we've got to focus on. And look, despite my saying that the Royal Commission was a waste of money, we've got to make sure those recommendations work now. I've got to put that aside. Got to work, and we've got to really have a substantial approach.
All right, Lenore.
So taking all of those systemic issues that Warren's talking about on board, I do think that raising the age of criminal responsibility and raising the minimum age for youth incarceration are good recommendations that should be adopted, because we see the evidence of what happens to young people once they've been incarcerated and how difficult it is to get out of that spiral. So as part of the systemic change, I think they're good recommendations that should be adopted.
Murray.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not. I wasn't part of the Royal Commission. It's not for me to sort of go back over all the evidence and work out whether the Commission has made the right or wrong recommendations. They are what they are, and I think all of us need to now get on with implementing as many as they can. I mean, I've got 2 kids, one of whom is 10. I can't imagine him being held criminally responsible for his behaviour, and I would have thought that we are smart enough to come up with better ways.
Raising it to 12.
It's still pretty.
The questioner is saying that's just.
Yeah, she wants to go further. I think she wants to go further.
The age of 14.
Yeah.
Go to 14.
Look, again, I suppose I'm going to stick with what the Royal Commission found, that 12 was the right age. But I do think that all of us, state governments, federal governments, have got a massive job to look at how we are caring for vulnerable children. There are far too many kids right across Australia going into foster homes in difficult family circumstances, and that, as Warren says, that's where a lot of this stuff begins.
Joan, do you have a thought on this?
Well, I guess I probably just want to pick your brain a little bit more, Warren, if that's all right. I mean, that story that you told of 5 generations in the one family having such systemic problems, how do you go about tackling that? I mean, what do you do?
Well, it's to me, it's all very simple. I know people say it's hard and everything like that. You actually, first thing is action. One of the things with the Aboriginal communities, and I was on the drum only last week, week before, and all the 4 Indigenous people who sat on that, there was a human rights lawyer, there was myself, there was a TV commentator and another lawyer person. All of us said we don't actually believe the government's going to do anything. We've had 42 reports into this space since 2004. 42 inquiries. So
you're not
Royal Commissions.
Can I just confirm you're not talking about this particular government, this particular federal?
I'm talking about Labor, Liberal, National Party. All of them are as guilty as sin. They have 42 reports sitting on their desk since 2004 and done nothing, quite frankly. And you look at the statistics, they're getting worse. And so for us, from my side, for me, and sitting at the coalface of this whole thing is about we've got to have economic development happening in remote and regional Australia to get people into jobs, the parents into jobs. We need to be working on getting kids to school. I go to communities where you're lucky to get 30% of kids at school. Yeah. And this is the problem we're facing. And then we've got to deal with the criminal activity of people who are going into Indigenous communities into these areas and are sexually abusing people. And I can show you statistic after statistic of this whole area, which seems to get all too much for governments and people to
Warren, I'm going to interrupt you because I've got another question related to government and Indigenous people. It's from Peggy Yu.
Thank you, Tony. According to a Greens senator, there is strong support, strong community support for the concept of an Indigenous voice to be created. Why then does Prime Minister Turnbull think that the new advisory body made up of Indigenous representatives would inevitably become seen as a third chamber of Parliament? On the face of it, does it not make sense for Indigenous people to be given a voice to advise what they really need?
I'll start with James on this because it's your Prime Minister who decided, and the Cabinet, one imagines, not to go ahead with even asking people whether this was a good idea.
We believe that there are 2 chambers that can deal with these issues, being that the House of Representatives and the Senate, and there is no need to create an additional body. We've got a House of Representatives and a Senate where Neville Bonner was the first elected Aboriginal senator.
James, would you agree this is not a new body? It's an advisory group. It's not part of the parliamentary system. The idea is to actually give an Indigenous voice, the sort of thing you're hearing from Warren Mundine sitting beside you, to aid policy making. Well, you've got Indigenous voices in Parliament at the moment. You have, Ken Wyatt, a minister and a member of the Liberal Party from Western Australia. You've got Linda Burnley. You've got Melinda McCarthy in the Senate. I think I've forgotten someone.
Pat Dodson.
Pat Dodson, sorry. Also, so there are already voices for the Indigenous community sitting in the House of Representatives and the Senate and any other body, regardless of what you call it. The government's belief is it would create. It would just. It would not help in terms of finding a solution. I just want to hear from Warren on this.
Yeah, look, I'm not a supporter of it. I'll tell you that now straight up. We can set up an advisory.
Is that because Noel Pearson came up with it?
Yeah, no, it's because it's about the actual working mechanics of the whole process. The whole process is that we could set up a body tomorrow. When the Parliament sits, we could set up a body that is elected. And we had that in the past in regard to ADSIC. That was an elected body. And we had it in the past in regard to the National Aboriginal Consultative Council back in the Whitlam years, plus the National Aboriginal Council, which is post-Whitlam years. And so we've had these bodies in the past, and they were in charge of areas, and the record is not quite good.
Would you include your own advisory body in that regard?
Well, we weren't an elected body, so I don't include that in there. We were an expert panel that, like any other committee that was set up by government to do these things. So I wouldn't even say that we represented anybody. In fact, only thing we represented was our own individual expertise to put to the Prime Minister. In regard to, so we could do these things very simple. The concern I have is why does it need to be in the Constitution? And two, I think that needs to be sold to us. And two, they talk about it's going to review legislation that affects Aboriginal people. Well, name me legislation that doesn't affect Aboriginal people. Taxation affects Aboriginal people. Welfare reform stuff affects Aboriginal people. Military defence laws and that affect Aboriginal. There's not a law in the country that doesn't affect Aboriginal people. So is that going to be, a slow down of the whole parliamentary legislative process? And again, at the same time as we've got the best representation we've ever had in Parliament across the country in regard to Indigenous people, several just got elected in Queensland just recently, and you've got the second most powerful person in any government is the Treasurer, and in Western Australia is an Aboriginal person in Ben Wyatt. So I'm not sold on this whole idea because...
Okay, I think we get that point, so I'm going to hear from Murray.
Yeah, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with Warren on this one. My understanding is that this recommendation came out of the Uluru process, which was a very long-running, quite representative and large group of First Nations people who came together to work out how we could best come up with solutions to the very problems that we've been talking about. Their recommendation was that it would be useful to have an advisory type body, as you say, to provide advice to government about how we solve these problems. I suppose as a non-Indigenous person, I think it's pretty important that we listen to the voice of such a large representative body that's worked on this for so long. And to James's point, it's not as if this body will be passing laws, doing any of the things that chambers of Parliament would do. I just think it was incredibly disrespectful for the Prime Minister to rule out and his cabinet to rule out this body without really even thinking about it.
Lenore?
I agree. I think to set up a consultative process which was conducted diligently and in good faith, and then to rule out what it determined without actually really having the conversation. And I mean, the Uluru process didn't dictate precisely how this body should work or what it should be. It left it a bit open in order for there to be dialogue with the Parliament and with the rest of Australia. And for the government to just dismiss it before any real consultation had been undertaken, I thought was really dismissive. Wherever that would have ended up had the consultation happened.
Okay, we've got time for one last... Sorry, go ahead, Warren, yes, briefly.
If you're going to agree with that, then you agree with the treaty process, because that was one of their major recommendations that come out of that as well. Now, I'm a treaty person. I reckon the treaty process is a lot better than a consultative committee sitting anywhere. So I look at the Labor Party here, do you agree that we should have that treaty process?
I think that is something we should be looking at, yeah.
I don't think James does.
No, that's correct.
Okay. Time for one last question. We've got a nice concise answer from a politician for last. It's from Gary Azar.
My question is to Jan Fran. I know that you grew up in Western Sydney and are from a Lebanese Maronite background. The western suburbs of Sydney had the highest concentration of no voters in all of Australia. Firstly, are you surprised? And secondly, do you believe that the MPs in these areas should follow through to what their constituents want and vote no, or give in to the majority of Australians and vote yes?
Jan.
Yeah, good question. Gary, did you say? Yeah. I feel like, are you Maronite Lebanese from Blaxland, perchance?
No, I'm Syrian Orthodox from Parramatta.
All right. I got you though. You still count. It's all good. First question, was I surprised? No. I wasn't particularly surprised. I was surprised that the no vote in Blaxland was as high as what it was, but I had always suspected that Blaxland would probably vote no. On the question of whether Jason Clare, who is the member for Blaxland, should vote with his electorate or vote with his conscience, is a difficult one. I tend to believe... I feel like politicians have two jobs, right? The main one is to represent their electorate, and the other one is to think about the future of Australia and the role that they play in the future of Australia as a country, right? And I wouldn't begrudge Jason Clare if he decided to vote the way of his electorate, and I wouldn't begrudge Jason Clare if he decided to say, no, as per my conscience, I'm going to vote yes because I feel this to be a matter of national importance. So I have not really answered your question by the sound of it.
You should have been a politician.
I should have been a politician, shouldn't I?
Because the question began with how you grew up, and you've obviously got some sort of awareness of religious sensibilities in the community. Was there an awareness of gay people and homosexuality in general in your community when you grew up?
Look, I must say, growing up in Blaxland in the 90s and 2000s, I didn't know a single gay person. Certainly not in primary school and high school. I didn't. And it later transpired that there were people who were gay and they just came out later in life because it was very difficult to come out in an environment like that. I tell an anecdote in a piece that I produced for the feed, 7:30 weeknights on SBS. Great show. I tell an anecdote that there's, in speaking colloquially, because there's modern standard Arabic and there's colloquial Arabic for those who don't understand, who don't speak the Arabic language. But in kind of colloquial conversation, there was no word for gay in the conversations that you would have with people in my family, right? So you would use kind of a hodgepodge of words, or the words that I heard used were like, it would translate to those other types, or in some cases it would be something similar to sexual deviance, something along those lines, right? So there's an incredibly kind of, I guess it's a different sort of level of experience that happens out there. Now, I'm not justifying this, and I'm not saying it's good, and I'm not saying it's correct, and I'm not saying it should remain that way. But what I'm saying is that if you're trying to change hearts and minds in Blaxlands, and you're somebody that is a yes campaigner, and you are trying to reach out to communities over there, I think it's really important to understand where it is that people are coming from, so that you can kind of understand how to reach out to them.
And how would you do that?
Ooh, that is a good question. I think visibility is really important, and I think having gay Arabic-speaking people being really visible is really important, because they are the people that young, gay, Arab-speaking people in Blaxland are going to look at and say, you know what? They're normal. Of course they're normal. It's possible.
We've got someone in the audience with their hand up. I'll just quickly take your comment. We're nearly out of time.
The people in Blaxland voted along with more than a third of the voters. No. And I'd like to know whether you think that we're entering a time when those people are more likely to be penalised for holding that point of view.
I'm afraid that is a question we're going to have to deal with in another program. We just don't have time to answer it, so we'll take that as a lingering thought and a comment. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Warren Mundine, James McGrath, Jan Fran, Lenore Taylor and Murray Watt. Thank you very much to all of our panellists and our audience. There's no Q&A extra tonight, but you can head to Facebook and join the discussion around tonight's Q&A. Joining us next Monday, Liberal power broker Erica Betts, Labor Senator and Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Lisa Singh, the former President of the Human Rights Commission, Gillian Triggs, the Director of Policy at the IPA, Simon Breeny, and Boyer Lecturer, Cultural Anthropologist and Futurist, Genevieve Bell. Until next week's Q&A, good night.